Max Ralph. That's Johnny McGonigal. Folks, it's a Thursday afternoon live session here for us on PennLive. Johnny and I, it's been a little while, and I'll shoulder the blame for that, having been out on some PTO at the end of the summer, just before the season gets rolling. But of course, the season is here. Penn State started fall camp on Wednesday. We are going to get Penn State Local Media Day on Saturday. There's a lot going on, and really, Johnny, as you and I and everybody who listens knows, this is now a marathon that we are starting, and it's getting rolling. But Johnny, I think I mentioned it on a podcast recently. I'm sure you talked about it while I was away, but and I'm sure our fans have seen it. But you started working on some Eagles coverage as well. Doing great work already in your first week. It's been fun seeing all that come out. If you guys are Eagles fans, which a lot of you Penn Staters are, make sure you check him out and keep following. But you are still around for Penn State, and I think this Thursday show will be a staple. So, Johnny, welcome back to the live show. How good does it feel to be back on the Blue White Breakdown right now?
It feels great, Max. It feels great. I mean, look, I've got football, in the NFL. I got football Penn State. Like last week I was there for the first day of Eagles training camp down at the NovaCare complex in South Philly. Penn State opened their own camp yesterday on Wednesday. We'll be up in State College on Saturday for Team Media Day, where we're talking to James Franklin, Jim Knowles, Andy Kotelnicki. Every player under the sun is going to be available to talk. And I couldn't be more stoked, man. I couldn't be more stoked. We're less than a month away from the Penn State season kicking off. I've got an Eagles preseason game next week. All the football. We're almost there, 1 day away from August, and that means we're in a football month. And I love to feel that. I love it. Yeah,
it does feel good. The Hall of Fame game is tonight, this Thursday night. Like, that's crazy. I don't know. I feel like this summer flew by, but we're here. Penn State is getting going, and that means it's a good time for us to kind of set some expectations, I guess, and discuss a little bit further about this roster and what we expect from Penn State. But more specifically, look, this is a team that we have talked on and on and on about, you and I especially, Johnny. They should or could be the number one overall team in the preseason poll. That does not come without questions, as you put a story up on PennLive here this morning that we're going to kind of use for the bulk of what we do here today. 5 questions that still need to be answered that we want to see in training camp. We can go as minute as we want to here, but we'll start out with what you wrote down. And so I'm going to kind of I'm going to lay it up for you and let you run for a little bit, since it was your story to begin with, and we'll see where we go at the end of this. But first things first, and this was the biggest offseason change for Penn State. Jim Knowles is here. What's his defense going to look like? That's kind of what we need to know, and what we'll get a feel of throughout camp as we talk to players and assistant coaches.
Yeah, absolutely, Max. I think this is one of the biggest storylines of training camp, certainly one of the biggest storylines of the offseason, one of the biggest moves of the offseason across all of college football was Penn State and James Franklin and Pat Kraft being able to pry away Jim Knowles from, the national champions from Ohio State. He was coordinating their defense, number one defense in the country, and was a big part of the Buckeyes winning it all. And the fact that they were able to, with a lot of money, obviously, and also the guarantee and the understanding that Penn State is also a national title, caliber program, get Jim Knowles, a Pennsylvania native, away from Ohio State and into the building, in the Lash building in State College and with the Nittany Lions. And so that's a big deal. But now it's like, okay, well, what is this going to look like? I think from a schematic standpoint, we understand it's going to be a 4-2-5, which is similar to what Penn State has run, Tom Allen, Manny Diaz, where you have 4 down linemen, 2 linebackers, 5 defensive backs. But what that specifically looks like, who are in those roles, what does that 5th DB role look like? Is it going to be a safety? Is it going to be a corner? Are they going to use a little bit of 4-3 base, or like how, in terms of standing up defensive ends, shifting stuff around? What is all this going to look like? Mm-hmm. We didn't really get a good look in spring camp. We got a good look of Jim Knowles, walking around, looking at the, position coaches, the position groups, taking his notes and overseeing everything. But a reason why we didn't get a great look at what this defense is going to look like, it's kind of twofold. One, he's just getting in the door, a few months prior, and he's setting, the foundation of his defense. But also there were a lot of guys who were not active on the defensive side of the ball during spring camp. I mean, we'll run down the list. Zane Durant and Denai Dennis-Sutton, a pair of veterans, were mostly held out to avoid injury. That's what they do with some of those guys, put them in bubble wrap. But Tony Rojas, missed the spring after coming back from an off-season surgery. Zion Tracy missed the spring with an injury. Alonzo Ford, who, could be, the other starting defensive tackle next to Zane Durant, missed the spring after suffering a season-ending injury late last season. And so you have all these pieces that are now coming back and hopefully fully healthy, expected to be fully healthy for training camp. And now it's up to Jim Knowles to fit all these pieces in and see what it all looks like.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. The fifth DB thing, I think that's going to be a hot topic this Saturday when we get the chance to talk to him. A guy like Zion Tracy did a good job with it last year. He's in the mix. Colin Dinkins, who's played both corner and safety in his career. I think even King Mack fits in there. But everything you said does kind of lead us into your second note, which we've discussed at length as well, just because of the circumstances this summer. And Bob and I talked about it again on Monday. But this defensive line is probably the biggest question mark. And before we do get into that, I just want to make one more note about Jim Knowles, is that James Franklin does a really good job of when he's hired defensive coordinators. If you look at Manny Diaz, if you look at Tom Allen, all the way back to Bob Shoop and Brent Pry, he has tried to keep the scheme consistent. The places that I do think Jim Knowles is going to be different this year, and we'll see it when it plays out, but I don't think he's going to blitz nearly as much as a Manny Diaz or a Tom Allen did, especially Manny Diaz, because he was kind of a wild man. I mean, it worked out, don't get me wrong, but he just was all over the place. The thing that Knowles does is the disguise of his coverage is really well regarded across college football and across the players that he's coached so far. He does a very good job of confusing opposing quarterbacks, and he will blitz, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it will be quite as often as we've gotten used to over the past few years at Penn State. And he picks his spots, really, is what it is, and he'll be able to use that fifth DB in a lot of different ways, and I think it'll be interesting. But like you said, you hit the nail on the head. We've talked about it a lot. Max Granville's hurt. Alonzo Ford, Zane Durant, Denai Dennis-Sutton, they were all limited in the spring for various reasons. This is probably the biggest question mark on this roster right now. And we don't know who steps up. I mean, Zane and Denai are healthy. That's not a question. They were just held out for being seniors who don't need a full spring camp. But who steps up beside them?
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest, like for me, that's probably the biggest question of training camp. And this is one that's probably going to lead into all the way before the Oregon game, because, not to be disrespectful, but the way I kind of look at Penn State's first three games, they're kind of preseason games, Nevada, FIU, Villanova. But Max, you talked a lot about Jim Knowles and how he's so good at disguising coverages. And you look at the Ohio State secondary and even their linebacker play last year and how good they were in coverage. But, the secondary and the talent that he had. And Penn State's secondary is loaded with talent. A.J. Harris, Zaki Wheatley, we talked about Zion Tracy, Elliott Washington, King Mack, Dejon Lane. These guys are all big-time players with a lot of talent, and Jim Knowles is going to be able to use them, right? Mm-hmm. The problem with not blitzing and, relying on disguised coverages is if your front four isn't getting home, it doesn't really matter. The quarterback is going to have enough time, to sort through everything and find an open guy. So that front four has to get home. That front four has to pressure the quarterback. We believe, and fully have confidence that Zane Durant is going to be able to pressure the quarterback. We know Denai Dennis-Sutton is going to be able to pressure the quarterback. But outside of those two guys, where's it going to come from? I think Zariah Fisher, as a sixth-year senior, defensive end, there's a lot of belief in the Lash building that he is going to have a really big year for Penn State. And, he has shown signs of that earlier in his career, despite dealing with two major injuries that cost him a lot of time. You look at defensive tackle, I mentioned Alonzo Ford, who came on strong last year. He was having some positive momentum prior to that injury that he suffered last November. behind him, and I know that you and Bob talked about this, in Bob's, Vegas Big Ten Media Days debrief.
Yep.
But James Franklin mentioned 5 names, identified 5 defensive tackles he's counting on, as they look to replace Keziah Izzard and Devon J. Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
It's Durant, it's Ford, Xavier Gilliam, Ty Blanding, and Owen Wafel. Well, Wafel didn't play at all last year for the Wolverines after transferred in from Michigan. Blanding, I think, has appeared in 7 games across 2 seasons.
Yeah,
now,
not a lot of snaps.
Yeah, and Xavier Gilliam really stood out in spring camp, so I think there's an understanding there that he's going to be a big player for this defensive line, but there's just a lot of question marks. And then at defensive end, it's like, Nye White comes in from Texas A&M and he's a vet, but we didn't hear much of him at all during spring camp.
Mm-hmm.
Is it going to come from a younger player like Jalen Harvey? An older player hasn't played a lot, like Mason Robinson, maybe Malachi Williams, Yvonne Kemajo, the true freshman. There's just a lot of names that I think Penn State fans, unless you're a diehard, that they don't know right now, that they're going to get familiar with real quick.
Yeah, it's going to look a lot different than what we've seen over the past couple of years. I think if I'm picking, players that I think could really break out from those rooms, Gilliam is obviously the guy at D tackle. We've talked about him a lot, but it's also still just a guy that hasn't played a lot. And so I think it's worth continuing to pound the table on him and say, like, our expectation is for him to make a leap. At the end spot, I really believe, as it stands right now, we still have all of camp, all the practices we're going to see to change our decision. But as it stands right now, Zariah Fisher, of course, he's kind of been the buzzy name. But I think the other guy is Yvonne Kemajo, the freshman from Paint Branch in Maryland. Like, I don't know if he'll necessarily be a green light right away, just because of how it depends on how this room shakes out. If that older talent is ready, more so than we might expect, maybe they try and hold him to preserve that extra year. But he came on strong in the spring, and I think it'll be really hard for them to keep him away from the field. Johnny, I have one little bit of breaking news that I'd be remiss to not mention.
I was about to do the same thing to you.
Were you? Because this is perfect for you. But folks, Penn State and Pitt are playing each other, but that's maybe a little bit misleading because it's happening in basketball, which is still cool. It's still a great decision, I think, by these athletic departments, because in basketball you can get away with a little bit more high profile non-conference opponents than you can in football these days. But Penn State and Pitt meeting in a neutral site in Hershey, close to home for many of our PennLive subscribers and readers, at the Giant Center. And it's going to happen on December 21st, maybe a Christmas present for some people, early Christmas present to see the Panthers and the Nittany Lions face off. Johnny, I mean, as a guy who's covered both programs and we've been in this long enough, we understand the rivalry, and especially between Pat Narduzzi and James Franklin on the gridiron, but it's happening in basketball. I think that's a win.
I love it. Yeah. I love it. Look, and James Franklin was asked about this out of Big Ten Media Days.
He was
about scheduling Pitt, and James, like as he has in the past, used it as a platform to talk about in uniformity when it comes to conference scheduling across the country, taking a not so subtle jab at the SEC yet again for playing 8 conference games versus 9, which is what the Big Ten plays. So with 9 conference games, the Big Ten, Penn State included, for football, is going to continue to look at non-conference scheduling as a way to rack up the wins and just get ready for the conference slate, which is grueling. And so you play an extra game in that. I understand James Franklin's, thinking on that. I'm a guy who's like Pitt and Penn State should play every year because it's fun. Having covered those games, it is a lot of fun having covered both programs. And, talking to fans of both fan bases, it is really fun to be a part of. So I'm happy that basketball is doing it. I know volleyball has done it, and those have been some great matches, 2 really good programs, women's volleyball programs. And, in terms of, the basketball teams, I mean, Jeff Capel, they made the tournament, I believe it was a couple of years ago. And, Penn State is trying to get back. So, I mean, look, I don't know if I'll be. One of us will be there.
Somebody will be there for sure. Yeah.
I mean, Hershey's close enough. Absolutely.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, both programs are, not particularly strong at the moment. But I do have to give kudos to Mike Rhodes and Penn State for the efforts that they've made in kind of expanding the Penn State brand, the Penn State basketball brand, through different parts of the state and the area. Doing this against Pitt and playing in Hershey, and going out to Philadelphia, playing Drexel, playing at the Wells Fargo Center, playing a home conference game at the Plester every year. They went down to Baltimore last year. Those are good things to do when your program does not have a lot of traction. And I think that it's smart. We'll see what the product really looks like. But we are still here to talk more about football. So let's get back into it. And a reminder as well that we are live for all you folks that are here. If you'd like to drop a question or a comment, we'll try and get to it. We like to have some fun with this live show, so come chat at us. But Johnny, let's move on to question number 3. You posed 5 of them in your story this morning, so we're on 3 out of 5. And this one's going to take a while to answer, I think. And we don't have an answer right now, like we kind of do at D-line, at least an answer we think we have. But who's going to play right tackle? I mean, this is a tough one because Anthony Donko and Nolan Rucci were both proficient last year, and in many cases even more so. Both are healthy and back. This is a good problem to have, but it's still a problem that needs to be sorted out.
Absolutely, Max. I mean, Anthony Donko played great last year up until his season-ending injury. I'm still baffled by the EA Sports game developers that they gave a 77 overall. That should be fixed pretty quickly. And if he starts and plays well in the first couple of weeks, maybe the game update will reflect that. But jokes aside, Anthony Donko played really well last year before that injury. Nolan Rucci stepped in after losing the starting job, not losing the starting job, but losing out to Donko for the starting right tackle job in the preseason. Nolan Rucci stepped in and played exceptional down the stretch. I mean, he was one of the best offensive linemen, maybe the best tackle in the college football playoff last year with the way that he played during Penn State's run to the semifinal. So if you're Phil Troutline, offensive line coach, who do you start? Well, one of those guys is going to have to separate themselves. You would think maybe Rucci and the way that he played down the stretch would give him an edge, but you don't want to forget everything that Donko did and how he earned the job in the first place this time last year. So this is something that, is going to be sorted out over the course of the next month plus. Again, I mentioned kind of that preseason for Penn State in the first 3 games of the year. I think both of those guys, I wouldn't be surprised if they rotated series and just see who is playing the best going into September 27th when Oregon comes to Penn State for the Beaver Stadium whiteout. But Phil Troutline and that offensive line, they believe that they're one of the best, if not the best, offensive line in the country. They have a poster of the Joe Moore Award given to the best offensive line in college football plastered on the wall in the offensive line room in the Lash building. They see that poster every single day. They believe they have the talent and the depth to win that and to lead this Penn State offense and this team really and be the anchor and be the foundation. And really the right tackle is a big part of that too, because they've got 2 guys that I think most Big Ten teams and most teams across the country would take as starters right now.
I'm with you, and I'm with Penn State. I think this is, if not the best, among the best offensive lines in the country. The depth is just so incredible on paper. Obviously, things can play out differently, but you bring back 4 or 5 starters on a line that was solid to good to great last year, I would say. They were probably top 10, top 15 in the country last season, and they got almost all those guys back. I think what it really boils down to at right tackle, both those guys are going to play. That's the bottom line. They're both going to play. They're going to play a lot of guys across every position just to keep people fresh. 4 games, like you said, against Oregon, against Ohio State later in the year. They might play 17 games next season. That's a lot of wear and tear on the body. They're going to play a lot of guys in meaningful snaps too. It's not just going to be when they're up 30-40 on a Villanova. They're both going to play. But honestly, I think whoever gets that starting nod, yes, it'll depend on camp. But going into camp, if I'm going to give a leg up to either guy, just based on external factors and nothing else, I think it's probably Nolan Rucci because he had the hot hand going down the stretch. Anthony Donko is still coming back from that injury. totally expect him to be healthy. The staff feels that way too, but he is still coming back from that injury and may need some time to shake the rust off. And one other thing, and this isn't usually the way that anybody operates, but it is a fact if all things are equal. Nolan Rucci's out of eligibility after this year, and Anthony Donko is not. So, give the guy a chance to kind of showcase his talents if it's no difference between who you have on the field. I think that gives him the leg up right now, but this is something that is going to be carried on throughout the fall and probably, honestly, all the way through the end of the season. It's going to keep changing.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's arguably the biggest position battle. We talked about defensive line being maybe the biggest question mark for this team entering camp. Or, well, not entering camp. I keep saying entering camp. They started yesterday. So now the camp is underway. But over the next month, defensive line is probably the biggest question mark. Maybe the biggest position battle, though, to watch for me is the right tackle spot. Another one, though, Max, is one that I noted in the piece. Yeah. And that's backup quarterback.
Yep.
And, as long as Drew Allar stays healthy, if he stays healthy completely throughout the season, then it doesn't really matter. But we've seen over the years, we saw Bo Perbula go win the game for Penn State against Wisconsin, him and Jalen Reed with that pick six.
Yes.
Go win the game after Drew had to leave. We saw a few years ago out at Iowa when the backup quarterback didn't do so well. When Sean Clifford came out of that game and they lost a top 5 matchup in Iowa City, a game they were leading and they couldn't hold on to the lead because they couldn't score. Yeah. They couldn't get the snap off. We know how important backup quarterbacks are, not just at Penn State, but across college football. They are needed. They have to be ready. They have to be prepared. Who is that guy going to be behind Drew Allar? Because Bo Perbula is at Missouri now. He entered the portal before the CFP last year. And who was it who stepped up as the backup when he left? It was Ethan Grunkemeyer, who was a heralded true freshman. Would it have been Ethan if Jackson Smolik was healthy? Jackson Smolik last offseason suffered a long-term injury that kept him out, the entire season last year. So those two guys, Smolik and Grunkemeyer, are going to continue to compete for that backup job. It's both important this year, but also with an eye to 2026 when Drew Allar is no longer with the program, when he's in the NFL, when he gets drafted and goes off to the league. So those two guys are going to be competing. Every single rep is going to be important for Jackson Smolik and Ethan Grunkemeyer as they go towards and through training camp.
They are. I think Grunk probably has the leg up just because of the way last season ended. But look, Jackson Smolik has a really talented arm. And everything that we've heard from coaches and teammates is that he attacked his rehab from a major injury in a really good way and that he's been completely dialed in ever since. So I think this is a true competition heading into camp, and we'll see where it goes. I know for a fact that's going to be something James Franklin's asked about probably on Saturday and at least one more time, if not 2 or 3 before the opener against Nevada. But similar to the right tackle situation, I think you're going to see both of those quarterbacks in meaningful snaps early in the season. That's a huge key with games like Nevada, Villanova, and FIU on the schedule because they're games that you're going to win. They just are, if we're being honest with each other. They're games that you should win by 60. And so you're able to get guys who need experience like that in there in meaningful moments, whether it's the second or the third quarter. And, Penn State's going to do that. They learned from their mistake. James Franklin learned from his mistake big time with that Iowa situation you're mentioning where Taquan Roberson just simply was not ready. And that fell in a large part on the coaching staff. So, they're gonna rectify those mistakes, and you'll see a lot of quarterbacks this year. Johnny, the last question you mentioned here, and it's a good one, and it's one that's on everybody's minds, is pass catching. Who stands up? Who's the number one wide receiver? I think there's a feeling, an expectation that this group is going to be much better on the whole than what Penn State had last year. That's the vibe that we've gotten from everyone in the building thus far. But how much better? And who's the – they don't have another Tyler Warren, but who's the guy that kind of becomes Drew Allar's number one going into the season?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, but it's one that, they've got more options now than they did last year. Do they have a better option than Tyler Warren, who went in the first round and won the Mackey Award and one of the best tight ends we've seen in college football in quite some time? Mm-hmm. I don't think they have a better option. Certainly not. But will Drew Allar, will Andy Kotelnicki as offensive coordinator, will they have a better plethora of options? I believe so, because we saw what the wide receivers did and certainly didn't do last year. And in the biggest moments, against Notre Dame, against Ohio State, against Oregon, they were complete ghosts. That's just what it was. Like, the wide receiver room did not really contribute when it mattered most in those games. I think that's going to be different. That was the mindset. That was the goal going into the offseason when, they went into the winter transfer portal and they got Devontae Ross, 1,000-yard receiver from Troy, when they got Kyron Hudson, a big body target from USC, who has played, he played the Big Ten last year, played, in the Pac-12 prior to that. And then they got those guys and they said, we're still going to go after more. Like Pat Kraft in that February press conference, I still go back to it saying, it's no secret that we need another wide receiver. And that's after they already added two. And they went out and got Traber Pena from Syracuse, who was an all ACC player, almost 1,000 yards, 80 plus catches, was Syracuse's number one target in a pass happy offense. So you add three new wide receivers on top of what you already have, which, at wide receiver, it's Liam Clifford, Tysier Denmark, who I think has flashed a good bit and could be a really good player for Penn State, whether it's this year or next year. Caden Saunders, who's still trying to find his footing and live up to that high billing he came in as a recruit. At tight end, Luke Reynolds looks like an absolute stud. Khalil Dinkins is a good tight end who's been in the program for a long time. Andrew Rappelier would have had a big role for this team last year if he didn't get hurt so early in the season. So you have a lot of options, and that's not even mentioning Nick Singleton, who I thought grew a lot as a pass catcher last year. Katron Allen is really focused on that in the offseason. So I think you're going to have more options and more to work with if you're Andy Kotelnicki and Drew Allar. It's just a matter of, is one of those guys going to step up and be a true number one when it's 3rd and 7 against Oregon? You need a first down to continue a drive and go win a game. You always went to Tyler Warren last year. Who is going to be that guy for this team this upcoming season?
I had to mute my mic. They're mowing the lawn right outside my window. I just moved into this apartment last Friday, so hopefully this is not a weekly Thursday at noon deal that they're doing. But
I didn't hear you.
Okay, good. I don't know. They're somewhere else right now. But Johnny, you're absolutely right. Like, there is not another Tyler Warren. There is not. But this group on the whole, it's kind of like Moneyball. They're kind of recreating him in the aggregate in a way that they simply did not have last year. And I think when you start to talk about a Tysier Denmark, a Caden Saunders even, and a Liam Clifford, guys who, if healthy, probably could have contributed. Caden Saunders is who I'm talking about specifically. Could have contributed much more last season than he did. Liam Clifford, a leader in the locker room, guy who knows the offense, good blocker. And then Tysier Denmark, a guy who, like you said, has flashed and could find his way into the rotation. When you're talking about those guys as almost purely depth pieces for right now, it's a much better situation than last season, where we're saying, oh, look at all this potential they have as guys who haven't even cracked the rotation yet and have to. And it didn't happen. And that's why you said they were ghosts down the stretch. They have proven production in that room. Is there a number one, though? My guess, with the way that Andy Kotelnicki runs his offense, the way that he's spread the ball, I'm going to say no. I don't think Penn State really gets a 1,000-yard receiver this year. I think it's probably 3 or 4 guys that have like 400 to 800. I think it's a very balanced room, but I don't know if I see one guy standing head and shoulders above the rest. That can all change. We might walk out to practice for the first time in the coming week and say, oh my God, Traber Pena is the real deal. But I just, right now, I don't think that happens. And I think part of that is because even at tight end, you mentioned Luke Reynolds. Yeah, he's a stud. He's really good. But they have Khalil Dinkins, who's really good too. And if he's healthy, Andrew Rappelier, who's really good too. Like, they're just going to be able to do a lot around the field. And assuming Drew Allar is comfortable with all of those guys, I think that he can really go anywhere for the bulk of it this season.
Yeah, I said, I'm hearing some echo. I hope we can figure that out. But I wrote earlier this offseason that, I didn't think Penn State would have a 1,000-yard receiver this upcoming season,
Yeah.
like Tyler Warren. Like, I don't think they're going to have a guy that you're force feeding the ball to necessarily. But like in the scenario that I mentioned, if it's 3rd and 7 against Oregon, you need to go get points. You need, whether it's a field goal, touchdown to go win the game, whatever. You need someone that's a dog at wide receiver, and they didn't have one last year. They
Yeah.
just didn't like. Harrison Wallace was a solid player, and he'll probably put up numbers at Ole Miss after transferring there, or like a Keandre Lambert Smith did at Auburn.
Yeah.
Amari Evans was good for what he was in terms of the straight line speed and taking advantage of some one-on-ones down the field. But at wide receiver, they just didn't have a guy that they could consistently rely on to move the chains and to advance drives and go get you a first down. And my guess, if there's someone in that group, that it would be Trebor Pena, because he did it for Syracuse last year. He was the guy that they looked to at all times. It was really him and Rondé Gadsden, the tight end. So that would be my pick. But that's something that we have to see. And like you mentioned, Max, we might go out to practice next week, and we might see a one-on-one Devontae Ross against AJ Harris, and he puts him in a blender. And if that's the case, that's the other thing too I want to mention here, because this is something I'm going to pull from Eagles training camp. When I was there last week, and we're talking to AJ Brown, and AJ Brown was saying how one of his goals of training camp is to make Cooper DeJean an all-pro player. Like, going against me, going against Devontae Smith. I almost said Devontae Ross. I'm getting my Devontaes mixed up. You're going against those guys is going to really help him, right? Well, for these wide receivers, like going up against AJ Harris is going to help, because AJ Harris is one of the best corners in college football. Going up against Elliott Washington, who I think is a really good player, is going to help these guys. And so, when you have that kind of experience in training camp, that helps tremendously going into the season. And again, those first 3 games, those first 3 preseason games, pad the stats, get the confidence up, get the vibes going with the passing game, going into a really big game against Oregon.
Yeah, I think it could be Kyron Hudson too, because of the big body that he has as a wide receiver. He's also a 5th-year guy who is, he's been through this. He's been through it on the big stage too, at USC, playing in a lot of high-profile games. They've got options, but you're right. One of those guys has to come out and prove that he can be Drew Allar's, security blanket, for lack of a better term. I think that those were the 5. I do want to make 2 quick shout outs. Chris Campbell and David Flannery. They're chatting at us, and they're enjoying the show. Appreciate you guys for tuning in. No questions, but nice comments. We're happy you guys are there. We've had a good crowd today, so. As always, as we get to wrapping up here, if you got questions, let us know. Johnny, we don't have to go as deep into these, but just 2 things that came to my mind as we talk about questions for me that I want to see answered, that I want to ask about this Saturday. What does linebacker look like in this? Because linebacker was the question mark before everything happened on the D-line. They bring in Amari Campbell, and that's a big add. That's a guy that we expect to really improve the depth and the overall consistency in that room. We're not really talking about it as big of a question mark right now. My question, is there a true middle linebacker in that room? Because Tony Rojas, Dom DeLuca, and Amari Campbell, none of them have been that guy in their career. How does that change? And then honestly, kind of a piggyback off of that is who's wearing the green dot this year, because you don't have that Kobe King. You don't have that presence. I certainly think it could be Tony Rojas, because he has become a really good leader and a heck of an athlete, great presence in that locker room, but it's a different role than what he's played so far. And so I think that those are 2 of the biggest questions for me right now heading into the camp session.
Yeah, I think both of those questions are kind of conjoined in a way, because I look at it and like, do they have a true middle linebacker? Well, I don't know that they do. I don't know that they necessarily need one with how they're going to play, but they do need someone that is going to obviously have that green dot and be on the field more often than not. And so it's like, okay, is Dom DeLuca going to be on the field enough to have the green dot? Is Amari Campbell going to be on the field enough to have the green dot? We know Tony Rojas is due for a really big role this year. So in terms of that green dot, that in-helmet communication between the coaching staff and the players on the field, getting calls in, getting instructions in, like Tony would be a good candidate for that. But I go back to June. when I was talking to Dan
Dan Campbell.
They would love Dan Campbell on their coaching staff, but he's doing a pretty good job in the Detroit Lions.
It's a little bit of a step down for him.
Yeah. With with Dan Connor, Penn State's linebackers coach, and he was asked about the green dot. And at that point in June, he said, look, it's still the summer. We haven't sorted all that stuff out yet. It might not even be a linebacker. He said it might be a safety. And my mind went right to Zaki Wheatley, who has been in this program for a long time, has played a lot of football. And you talk about players always going to be on the field. Zaki Wheatley is always going to be on the field. So maybe it's him at safety. I don't think they would go on D-line. I don't think they would go with Deny. Like that's, I've never had in-helmet communication on the field, but I can imagine as a defensive end, it's a little bit tougher not being able to see what's in front of you and all that kind of good stuff, right? Like typically it's a linebacker, but you could make do with a safety. So that's what I'm looking forward to seeing too. And that's an early question that we'll have for James Franklin.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of these things that we brought up today are going to be addressed sooner than later. Like we said, Saturday is Penn State Local Media Day. It's going to be a huge – oh, you got one more thing.
One more thing, and I almost tossed it in the story as like an honorable mention, but I feel like it's going to be its own separate story at some point, whether it's Saturday or, in the days and weeks after. But, we talk about backup quarterback. Just one more I want to throw in there in terms of position battle. I think you know where I'm going with this, is backup running back.
Yeah.
Because Penn State has been really, really lucky that Nick Singleton and Katron Allen have stayed healthy throughout the course of their career. I know Nick, dealt with an injury last year, and that kind of slowed him up in the middle of the Big Ten slate. But they haven't had any like season-ending injuries or anything like that. They've been able to rely on those two guys over the last 3 years, and they're hoping that remains the same. Big reason why they came back was to boost their draft stock and contend for a national title. If they want to contend for a national title, and you talked about possibly playing 16, 17 games this season, they're not going to be able to take on like that crazy of a workload. Like they're going to want to work in some other running backs. Well, who would that guy be? Mm-hmm. Is it Quentin Martin? Is it Corey Smith? Is Cam Wallace back from, the leg injury he suffered last fall, which was not great, you having to be helped. That was just a tough scene. I still remember, Nick Singleton didn't even want to talk about it because they care a lot about that guy in that room. And for him to pick up that injury when he did was really unfortunate. But hopefully Cam Wallace is able to come back and be fully healthy. So you've got Cam Wallace, Quentin Martin, Corey Smith, Tyke Hayes, the true freshman out of Aliquippa, turned some heads in spring camp. And I'm not saying he's going to jump up to be the number 3, but certainly possible.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of guys in that room with the new running backs coach and Stan Drayton, not new anymore at this point, but it's his first season coaching the running backs. And so I'm interested to see if any of those running backs behind Nick and Katron make some headway during training camp.
Absolutely. I think that's been a huge selling point throughout the careers of Nick and Katron, just the fact that those two being so good and so prominent keeps wear off of their own legs, both for this season and for the next level. But, based on things that I've heard, based on the comments from coaches, I think that guy right now is probably Quentin Martin. I think he's had a huge offseason. Last year was a guy who we weren't really sure physically if he was going to fit in. He had some jumping to do. I think he's made that jump, and I think he's ready. I think he's going to be a really good player in the future. And the other thing that he has is he has really good receiving ability. He can be used in a lot of different ways. But like you said, it's a really good running back room. There are 7 guys back there who realistically could probably see the field this year. They're not all going to see the field, at least not in significant ways, but it's a good room. Johnny, Chris Campbell did come in with a question here. Says, Cooper Cousins is from my hometown, and I'm really excited to see what he's able to do. Shout out Erie. Are you both confident in his ability, and do you think he's primed for a great season? Before I give it to you, and I'll just make it brief. Yes, 1,000% yes. I can dive into as many reasons as you'd like, but that is a hard and fast yes from me.
Agreed wholeheartedly. Everything that we've heard about Cooper Cousins ever since he stepped foot on campus when he early enrolled as a freshman has been nothing but positive. Talking to him, when they made the true freshman available after last season, he sounds like a vet. We're talking to Phil Troutline. I was last, in June, and asking him about Cooper Cousins. Like, I asked Phil, I'm like, does Cooper even feel like a second-year player? And he's like, no, because he's been around for so long, but he also does everything the right way. So Cooper really carries himself like someone who's, a fourth or fifth year guy. And he's also massive. He's also 6'6", as a guard, and maybe the future center of this program, looking to 2026 and beyond. But for this season, when you have Nick Dawkins at center, he'll be at guard. I think Cooper Cousins has a very, very bright future, and I think that bright future starts this fall.
It absolutely does. And even before he enrolled, Coop was coming to camps like every week. I think he went to 1 billion Penn State camps. He was the first commit in the class, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm pretty sure he was for a long time. He bleeds Penn State, man. And he's also a really good guy. He actually just today was put on the watch list for the Werfel Trophy, which is a community service award. He's done some really good stuff in the Penn State community. Certainly following in the footsteps of Nick Dawkins in that way, not just in potentially being a future center, but just uber talented kid who is primed for a really big year. Absolutely. So Chris, I think you'll be proud of the hometown this season. He's a big time player. Johnny, anything else we got to get to here?
I think we're good, Max. I mean, training camp underway. I'm looking forward to media day on Saturday. Linking up with you, Bob, Joe Hermit will be up there as well. Snapping some photos, and it'll be good stuff. I'm looking forward to it, man.
Yep. Like I said, the marathon is here. Folks, keep tracking with us as we do this. Really appreciate all of you who tuned in live, who dropped a comment or a question. And if you're watching recorded, we appreciate you too. Keep tracking with us because it's going to be a lot right now. And from now until the end of January, it's football season, baby. So lock in, love it, and we'll see you next time.